All right, so welcome back to Cracks in Postmodernity. I'm here with Default Friend, who is the host of a Substack and also the podcast, The Computer Room. So, for those who don't know, can you tell us a little bit about what's behind your project and the kind of stuff that you cover?
So I'm a little bit all over the place because I use my Substack sort of as like an emotional scrapbook and like a scrapbook for like different kinds of writing. But I also have like a separate, like more cohesive project. But given that I don't have like separate identities or even websites for each, they all sort of bleed into like one kind of confusing thing. But my research and a lot of my journalism and culture commentary is focused in contemporary internet culture and internet history, which I feel like has been mostly forgotten or cherry picked as as it's convenient, as it might make a good opening anecdote for a piece about something more grounded in the present. So I interview people about their digital lives. I believe, I don't know for sure, but word on the street is I have the most qualitative interviews on Tumblr
Oh,
that
wow.
has ever been done,
Okay.
including in academia. And the computer room is, I hesitate to call it a podcast because it's more like audio note taking, I guess, that I share
Mhm.
with the public. But it is a podcast. But I talk to people about their online experiences, um, and if they do work that's salient to any sort of internet studies. I asked them about that. I've had a really wide range of guests. So like everyone from like Mark Andreessen, who, is the progenitor of the web browser, to John Zerzan, who's probably the most famous anarcho-primitivist, besides Ted K, of course. And yeah, tons of like random people on Twitter and elsewhere who might have something interesting to say. Artists, just yeah, anyone who has a unique perspective on digital life.
Yeah, so I want to talk more about Tumblr because, I remember, unfortunately, my Tumblr days, and I don't know, it was so consuming, and it brought out sides of me that I'm definitely not proud of. But in your research on Tumblr and its whole formation, its influence, I don't know, what do you find to be most I don't know, what do you think is most significant about Tumblr and the way that it has impacted so much of our culture?
So there's a lot of ways to attack this, but I think probably the most visible thing is, so Tumblr got a lot of its user base when other digital spaces for fans weren't really working for those communities. The big one is LiveJournal,
Mhm.
and there's an academic, I believe her name is Casey Fiesler, if I'm remembering correctly, who's done a lot of work on like these sort of digital migrations. So LiveJournal was experiencing a lot of different problems. It had a lot of outages. It was, I believe at this time, bought by a Russian company, and there was there's some censorship that was happening. There's a lot of different difficulties that made it difficult for fan communities to continue to thrive there. So some of them migrated to an archive of our own, which is run by a nonprofit that's focused on fandom and studying fandom and the preservation of fan works, primarily fan fiction. And then the other part went to Tumblr. And fans are like a really, really important group. Any fandom is a very important group to get onto social media sites, because it's fandom's really defined as like a model of engagement, right? They consume the most, they're the most passionate, they do lots of free labor, they're very vocal with feedback. So if you're creating an app, you want to you like it's smart to say like which like let's get like people who like love baseball or like love Marvel or love the Grateful Dead on, because they're going to really, that's really what's going to help growth. So they all go to Tumblr, and this is a big piece of how Tumblr starts revving up. And media properties know that fandom is really anchored on this site. So they're paying a lot of attention to what's going on Tumblr. Not totally separately, right? Because a lot of teenagers are super fans of different things, K-pop, Marvel, what have you. But sort of separately, Tumblr is also extremely popular with adolescents. I think like in 2013, it was in the top 5 sites. I think it might have actually been #1 for that very precious like 13 to 17-year-old age bracket. So all of the sort of peculiarities of fandom start meeting the peculiarities of adolescents. So even like adult fans who who are like are super users of the site, adolescents also tend to have the same sort of myopia, and that's what really starts creating this like very unique culture that we think of as like Tumblr culture.
Yeah.
This two groups of misfits, right? And then plus with the user interface, there's not these like high barriers of entry anymore, right? So it's like everything sort of starts melding together, and you get things like Super Hulock, which, like, for people who don't know, it's the melding of Supernatural, Doctor Who, and Sherlock, and becoming like one its own beast, right?
Yeah.
Its own
Okay.
fandom. And so this is what lays the groundwork for this sort of like eccentric culture. And it's a lot of people who I speak to feel like they were radicalized. I mean, and it's a really loaded word to use, but you just spend so much time that even if you aren't there for fandom, or you don't believe sort of the stated the stated etiquette of these communities, you're looking at it so much you start internalizing it, right?
Yeah.
So this is the setup. The same time, digital publications are slashing budgets, and this isn't to say, I've described this mechanism a few times. So I want to be very clear. When I say that they're slashing budgets and that journalism takes a hit, I don't mean to suggest there was no good journalists, or that people don't know their craft, or that everyone sucked at their job. That's definitely not the case, right? There's plenty of great people doing great work. However, by the same token, you have people who like freelancers who may not have a journalism background, who don't necessarily know the craft, right? Who don't know how to don't understand what journalistic integrity means, not because they're malicious, but it's something you need to learn. As well as people who are really underpaid, like like $30,000 a year, who are told they need to pump out a certain number of articles a day, and they need to it needs to reach a certain amount of traffic for them to keep their jobs. And they're doing this with the promise that maybe one day they'll get to the prestige publication like the New York Times, and maybe they'll get a book deal, and right. So everyone's sort of competing for this. So you have these two groups of people, and obviously that atmosphere is not going to generate great work, right? So you see like a few trends start to emerge. You have sort of the like watered down version of like the Vice authenticity sort of scraping. So it's like gritty and real. You have confessional writing to the tune of like the XO Jane, it happened to me. And then you have these explainers, which are for, we also have listicles, right? But the real important part is like these explainers that are sort of exposing these communities that are like super weird, right? And this is a little bit before we get to the cancellation style of clickbait that is so well known, so maligned today, that was really like set into that Gawker really lit the fuse on. Anyway, so you have all these freelancers and journalists. The freelancers are often doing these for like $50 a pop. And where are they getting all these article ideas? They're scraping them from Reddit, which is I think pretty well known, but they're also scraping them from Tumblr. And so Tumblr is like, this is really fertile ground for all of this, right? And you have like because of this sort of like collision of different niche communities, it's so frequent. You have like stuff that seems like really weird, right?
Yeah.
The famous example, and the one that's been best documented, and the one that I always use because I think it's just so illustrative of this mechanism, is with homies. So homies are hybristophiles, which are people who sexualize, you know, murderers and criminals.
Okay.
And this was right around the Aurora shooting, which is when that, you know, that orange-haired dude, you know, James, his name is James Holmes, went
Mhm.
into a theater and you know, he shot up a movie theater, right?
Yeah.
So a small group of people on Tumblr is possibly even in jest sexualizing this man, and it gets reported
Okay.
on as though it's a huge movement of you know, teen girls who are going crazy over, you know, this murderer. And you know, at first it gets reported in BuzzFeed, and then you also have a thing happening at this time where people are, you know, if one thing's doing well, it gets copied, and sometimes it's even plagiarized, right? So it spreads on this sort of like the BuzzFeed tier of publications. And then a tier up, which is like your CNNs, your MSNBCs, right? Like, you know, maybe they're not prestige publications, but they're 24-hour news and they need to be pumping out articles too. They catch wind of this, and they start reporting on it. But the truth is, right, these articles make it sound like it's a big group of people, but it was really just, you know, shit posters or like a few weirdos.
Yeah.
However, once it gets published and once people, you know, hear about it, some people hear these things and they're like, actually, you know, that he is hot, right? Or like that's weird. I want to get, you know, I want to be involved in that.
Yeah.
And it grows the community. And what happens is, in searching for clickbait, you know, journalists engineered a community that would have, you know, either been very niche forever or just sort of, you know, slipped under the radar and would have been forgotten as the, you know, as the feed refreshed.
Yeah.
But this, you know, it's not just this situation. This happens a bunch of times. Arguably, this may have happened with Joe Arsenaev, who was a Boston bomber who allegedly had all these teen girls who loved him. Like how many
Wow.
were there, right? Were the numbers high enough to constitute this crisis? It happens with certain gender identities that seem
Mhm.
eccentric, or, you know, and when I say, you know, certain gender identities, I'm speaking of like, you know, aerosexuals or
Yeah.
sorry, or,
Yeah.
you know, whatever, like things that are just gender identities and sexualities, things that seem just like there's one of them in the world, and we've never heard this word before.
Yeah.
And this, you know, this
Mhm.
happens again and again and again. And you could take a few key stories and trace them, you know, through sort of these like hoops of like, you know, misinterpretation and telephone. And it really is the, you know, it really is this mechanism of scraping from Tumblr, which is already weird. And you already have the problem of people getting sort of sucked into it, and then reifying these trends that aren't really trends, or trends that are trends, and breathing life, you know, breathing more life into them than is perhaps deserved. And then, of course,
Yeah.
the other dimension here is media properties who have, you know, quite a bit of stake in these communities are also encouraging these communities to stay alive. So there's all these different angles where this like dysfunction is being encouraged, and it's like,
Mhm.
I think it's really it's really overlooked as, you know, a place of impact. I think something that people misunderstand about my work is, and where I see a lot of my criticisms come from, are people who think that I'm saying that like queer theory was, you know, invented on Tumblr, or, you know, something like this, or if not
Yeah.
queer theory, something else. That's of course not true, but I think that it spread in the way it did because of social media. And also, like, you know, think there's all sorts of words that if you were like cognizant in like the 90s or even early 2010s, meant one thing, and today means
Mhm.
something you know, different entirely.
Yeah.
And that happens because these communities sort of reinterpret things, and you know, and their reinterpretation gets reported as fact, and it's this really weird feedback loop that's existed for a long time, but I think was particularly bad as these digital publications
Yeah.
were stressed. Anyway, that was, sorry if that was
Mm.
like 8 minutes long. I'm
No,
sorry.
no, but it clarifies a lot because it makes me think about my own experience with Tumblr because I think I was probably like 19 or 20 at this point, and I was on Stumble Upon, and that's how I found it. So Tumblr came up randomly, and I ended up spending like the whole rest of the afternoon on it, just like following accounts and then reposting stuff. And I ended up getting involved in these like, these super niche kind of internet communities. And like one of them happened to be like the quote unquote Tumblr Catholics. So there was like this niche group of Catholics on Tumblr who would post like a range of like pietistic kind of kitschy stuff, but then also this really like ideological political stuff. And sadly, that was kind of my first orientation um to Catholicism. I mean, amongst other things, but like I don't know. It was kind of like for the worst though, because it became this echo chamber where like people would just reinforce these very narrow understandings of what's going on in society and blah blah blah. But in addition to that, then like I would just follow these singer fandoms. Like I'd follow like these dumb Beyonce fandoms. And then I started posting GIFs. And when it like the worst part of it for me, like a couple months after I discovered Tumblr, is when I went to study abroad in Spain. And already as someone who's like, I'm not the most outgoing, I'm not the most social, um, instead of like trying to challenge myself to go outside of my comfort zone and meet people in this kind of new environment, like I would just stay in my room and I would go on Tumblr for hours and hours. So I see how like it has such an atomizing effect, like being involved in these niche communities. Like, sure, on one hand, it can be affirming that you find other people who are like you, but for people who do have these kinds of, I don't know, like the tendency to keep to yourself, to like not be, I don't know, to be more introverted, I think it really exacerbates that, the imperative to go outside and like meet people and be challenged by people whose ideas are different from yours. But I think it also breeds that kind of mentality in general for whoever uses it. So I don't know. I'm just curious to understand more about like, I don't know, do you also see this kind of like atomizing effect on the culture that Tumblr and also another other websites have had on our culture in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Another sort of counter argument that I get is like, like teenagers are just like this, right? Like
Mhm.
teenagers have these sort of out there views. They grow out of it, or or sometimes they don't, right? Like, so, we have like people who are 60 years old and still like super goth in like a way that's kind of alienating, and that had nothing to do with the internet. And I agree with that. But the thing with
Yeah.
the internet is that it's very different when you're encountering these ideas physically, like
Yeah.
with a group of people who you're looking at. And I think there we have this tendency to like on one hand we sort of superficially acknowledge like the internet itself, and that computers itself, smartphones themselves, certain websites, the UI of these websites, these all matter, but I don't think we appreciate it enough and like really like think about like what is the impact of even doing this in a mediated way. um
Mhm.
so like you know getting sucked into these things and not actually like not having these same exposures in person, or somehow like needing to physically do something to have access to certain information. It has like a huge impact on us. Another place where I think that's really striking is like with porn. I happen to like be pretty anti-porn just sort of in general. However, like there's a huge difference between like you have to go to an adult theater or pay to get it on your television at home, or like walk into an adult store and look through a constrained selection and
Mhm.
buy it, and like the cashier knows that you're buying it. Like that's very different than just sort of
Yeah.
like opening up an incognito tab and like going to town, right? Like
Yeah.
I think this is like a very underappreciated thing, like even the
No,
amount of
that's a good
time
point.
that it
Yeah.
takes.
Mhm. No, because yeah, it's like as I was saying, that like the kind of porn you access on your computer, especially for free, like contributes to this whole ethos of like atomization, total disconnection from any human being, which I mean is what the essence of porn is. But no, like if you go out to purchase it outside of your home, like at least there's some awareness that sex implies you're something outside of yourself. It's not purely like you in a bubble gratifying yourself. I don't know. But then I also wanted to ask, so in the last episode you had on the computer room, you brought up something about Tumblr and MK Ultra. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's, I mean, this is like sort of a joke, right? But
Yeah.
my guest and I sort of have this, or that particular guest, we we had I this ended up getting cut out, but we sort of think that a lot of the ideas that were seeded on Tumblr, like, maybe, and this is just like a hypothetical, like maybe they were like planted there because they do sort of alien, like a lot of these ideas alienate you from who you are and sort of like further this like sleepwalking mechanism that's
Yeah.
already kind of baked into the internet. And I just feel like there's something, it hasn't totally congealed with, in my thinking, but I think there's something there. And I think the US government has been open about this in a sense, but hasn't been, honest. Like they're sort of directing us in one direction, but they haven't been honest about the details. Um, that like you do get radicalized. There is, it does have this huge impact on the culture. Like I don't think this is like Russian bots, right? It's not something like that, but I think there's something about like, is the pop culture that we're being exposed to online, that we're like sort of swimming in, is it shaping our worldview, and not in these, not just in the sort of obvious ways of like, oh, the mainstream media is bad and like, oh, Russian
Yeah.
bots, but is it like, does it even go a level deeper? And if you look at the way China talks about the internet, or the way Russia even talks about the internet and its impact, and the different things online that they make illegal, it's sort of like here's an example. Like in China, like certain kinds of fan fiction and fan engagement are illegal, right? And I think like, I don't have enough information, and I don't, and again, like it hasn't like totally taken shape for me, but I feel like there's something there. There's some reason, like there's something that they see that's it's bad for people. And I don't think it's just like, oh, fandom is like queer and they're threatened by queerness. I don't think that's it. I think it's something about like the way people are engaging online that they see as dangerous and weakening in some way. And I could also see that somehow being encouraged in the United States. But this is like one of these more esoteric ideas I have, and like I
I
don't
mean,
have a,
it's not
a
that
ton of research.
outlandish. I could see
Yeah,
it, but even, I mean, even if it's not an intentional plot, it definitely does further in, I mean, I think it does further corporate and political interests of those in power. I mean, I think that's hard to deny.
right.
Hmm. Well, that being said, what do you think about, I mean, like what differences do you see between the effect that Tumblr and then like newer apps like TikTok is having on younger people, if
I
any?
think that I think it's very much the same.
Hmm.
But like the interesting thing about TikTok is like it creates the illusion of celebrity, and even gives you opportunities to earn money without giving you any like power.
Yeah.
Whereas like on, like there's in very rare cases have people been able to break out from TikTok and like become celebrities. But often it's like it seems very sort of flimsy, and like not really like durable in the same way. Like there's almost too much noise, right? Like you have like a Charlie D'Amelio or something where but it's like that's like there isn't that like that many people like that. It's like it's sort of rare. There's the hype house, these but it's they also don't have like the same kind of influence. Whereas like Tumblr, it was much more like collaborative with other people and much more connective with other people.
Mm,
So you
okay.
could become, like micro celebrity on Tumblr to me like functioned a little bit differently than it does on TikTok. I think TikTok makes you think that you're connecting more and that it's easier to climb the ranks, but further atomizes you. And I also think it's much easier to learn things on TikTok just because of the nature of the app. You know, TikTok originally, like before it was Musically, it was I forget exactly what it was called, but it was supposed to be an education app. The idea was these short videos. If you watched a bunch of them, you would learn better. And I think that's still true. It's like the original iteration of this app failed miserably because it was like kind of boring and like, you know, no one wants to learn about science in this way.
Yeah.
But you know, I've often thought like you could learn a language. You know, if you're doing like dedicated study, if you supplemented it with like French TikTok, you'd probably start picking it up really quickly. I feel like I
Interesting.
learned a lot about cooking just by looking at a lot, like because
Mhm.
you're getting so much information that if you curated it, you'd be in, you know, you'd it'd be in pretty good shape. So
Yeah.
it has like a lot of, so it's not just going to apply for things that are constructive like cooking or language learning or science. It's also going to like slowly condition you in other ways. And you know, again, like I think like the propaganda stuff isn't as obvious as like, oh, like it wants you to sympathize with Russia or Ukraine or whatever, right? Or it
Mhm.
wants you to think the Chinese government is great. I think it's like it's even more insidious. Like, is the way we conceive of music different because of TikTok? Do we
Yeah.
think of our, you know, a lot of people say they think
Yeah.
in tweets. What does it mean to think in TikTok videos, right? Like there's like little things like
Mhm.
that that are more structural, that I think have a big impact on you. Just in the same way Tumblr, you know, in a lot of ways had an impact on the way people are even thinking about things. Um, you know,
Yeah.
different humor styles. You know, it's a really big and broad topic.
Yeah, no, and it makes me think like the difference between the written style in Tumblr versus the audio visual in TikTok. Because for me, in addition to like posting pictures and GIFs, like I feel like my impulse to start writing like articles and essays was like inspired by Tumblr because I would see people do these like micro, I don't know, these micro essays. And then I was like, oh, let me try doing this. And the more I did it, like people would encourage me to like, well, why don't you actually try publishing? So now that you say, like, I realize without Tumblr, I probably wouldn't have thought to try doing that. But then at the same time, like for younger people, as time goes on, the written word isn't as it's not as stimulating. Like people aren't going to want to learn from reading a little micro analysis post. And I think this is where TikTok comes in. And like I see in my work with younger people that like they're constantly bringing up TikTok, like as you said, like what if I play a song, they're like, oh, that's the TikTok song. And I'm like, I had no idea that this song was a TikTok craze at any point. But then with like actual information about, I don't know, social issues, historical events, like young people will send me these TikToks and be like, "Oh, did you know about this and that?" And like, what gets me especially though is these TikTokers who claim to be like, "Oh, I'm gonna expose like the real story behind like this historical event or this historical figure, what the history books aren't telling you." And people are like, "See, you know, this is what they've been hiding for us all along." And I'm like, "Well, what if they just pulled that out of their ass? Like, how do you know that's real?" And then what ends up happening is like you keep, you know, it becomes this echo chamber where if somebody challenges your point of view or your opinion, like you don't have the tools to actually engage in a meaningful conversation. It's just like now they've become the enemy who's challenging what I heard from the TikTokers I follow. So again, like back to this you know, corporate and political interest, like I think if anything, the main effect that TikTok can have is like it creates more and more divisiveness to the point that like I don't know, you just keep feeding these narratives to people and they have no means to actually think through them and again be challenged and challenge others, you know.
Yeah, and I mean like the, you know, the history thing, like it also I think probably I don't know if you're speaking of like, you know, teenagers, right? When you say young
Yeah.
people, but like,
Hmm.
you know, you and I probably learned these stories and you know these about these events through not just through a book, but through a teacher who we saw in real life. And I think that, you know, when it's mediated through Zoom, it's much easier to tune it out. It's not as personal. So you really,
Mhm.
if you're learning at all, you really are just learning through a book. So even if the information is flawed, the way we received it in the first place is so much different. And
Yeah.
it's maybe, not that it makes it easier to dismiss if you receive it in this other way, but like your relationship with it has changed. And you're, what you even think it is, like it changes the whole game, and like how you remember it, and how important it seems. So there's a lot of
Yeah.
dimensions to it.
Yeah, and like the other thing that, because I teach like philosophy, theology, that kind of stuff. Like sometimes these, like it's mostly teenagers, they'll show me these like TikTok philosophers or like people talking about religion. And it's always this person speaking in this kind of like very smug, skeptical way that's, very very compelling because they seem so confident, they seem so convinced that like, and what I'm going to tell you is different from, the mainstream narrative, from what, those in power say. And they just like believe it because of the posturing, because of the way they're performing. And I'm like, but wait, did you actually sit and think about what they're saying, or are you just regurgitating it because they sound cool, or they sound like, they know what they're talking about? Um, and that's like, this is my biggest fear, is that we're convinced that what these people say are true just because of the way they're presenting the information. And then we lose the capacity to think critically and engage with ideas for ourselves. And like, I don't know, I just get afraid when I see teenagers regurgitating stuff TikTokers say, and there's no nuance. Like there's no original thought. There's no sense that like I can think through this myself and come up with my own understanding or my own idea, because we're losing the tools, we're losing the capacity to do so if we're only getting our information from a resource like TikTok.
I mean, it's good that they're telling you about it, because I think like one way to sort of, fight back against that is just talking about it and putting people to task. I mean, this happens to me all the time, and
Mhm.
it's embarrassing to admit, but I think important. Like, I'll fall down a rabbit hole, and I'll like be like gung ho about a theory, and I don't realize how stupid it is, or like how poorly thought out it is. Like even after writing like tons of like 6,000 words of stuff on it, right, or more, until
Mm,
I get on a podcast and someone starts asking me about it, and I'm like, I can't, like
interesting.
I don't, right, using your voice and having to think about it on the spot without notes, in a free way where someone can challenge it, and you don't feel threatened necessarily, but like you're really you're just engaging with the material. It goes a very long way. So I mean, I think, one way to combat, like, you can't get rid of TikTok at this point,
No.
and people are going to stay plugged in, but you could combat it by just talking about it, and not letting the engagement happen only through text, because when you're
Yeah.
sending it back and forth, right, then like, it's still in this like myopic kind of narrow view. But if you have to physically engage with it, then it somehow becomes different.
Hmm. I think what gets to me though is that the primary concern of a lot of the young people I work with is like wanting to have the right opinion, wanting to be on the right side, as opposed to having an original one. Like there's no, I don't perceive an imperative to originality or to nuance. It's like we want to be right. And I mean, I think that's endemic to American culture going back to the beginning. But if that really is the only thing that's important, then I feel like we're screwed. Like if we just want to be right because we're afraid of being immoral, we're afraid of being canceled, like then what do we have left? Like moralism cannot sustain a culture. I don't know. That's what I get afraid of when I hear
I
those
mean,
kinds of
I think you're right. And I mean, there's, for the people who are interested in thinking, or this sort of like, like, I feel like there's sort of like a backlash against what's the social media consumption that started when we were teenagers, and then you have people who are, do like move towards theory, and right, and then what they get sort of attacked and psyoped by, you have to monetize your takes, and then you have the people, like people who are Twitter power users, right, which is the sort of intellectualized, sleepwalking TikToker, right?
Mhm.
It's and it's jockeying to like who has the best take.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean it's I think you're right. It's scary and it's sad. But like what it's so baked into the culture. And there's so many there's so much pressure. I think it's even like filters down to something like how often do people read for leisure,
Yeah.
right? Like it's or like
Mhm.
want to engage with different ideas just because it's the exercise of having an interesting conversation, as opposed to like I need to read this so I can understand this and then have the most original take and then write about it and then hopefully someone notices it. And it's like it's or you want to be like sufficiently woke or anti-woke or whatever.
Mhm.
It's kind of sad.
Yeah, and like this makes me think of just over the last week seeing what's been going on in Russia and Ukraine. Like what I perceive, for at least from a lot of the people that I follow on the internet, is like this impulse to post something, whether it's like pray for Ukraine or donate to this charity or whatever, as a means to distract from the fact that like so much of I don't know, I feel like it's a way to project our sense of like emptiness, our sense of being disillusioned with our own daily lives. So like if we can point to some issue out there in the world that's very removed from my daily experience, and like I don't really have to face the fact that I'm not satisfied, I am bored, I don't know what I'm living for. And I see that in myself too. Like, no, like I haven't been posting about the Ukraine, but I fixate on some big issue as a way to distract from my own disillusionment. Um, and I'm like, I don't know. I wonder, is there a way to like, how do we face that sense of atomization, disillusionment with our daily lives, while still taking seriously that yes, like there are real issues out there. Like, is there some synthesis that brings together like my daily life, my daily reality with what's happening out there across the world?
Yeah, I think about this a lot too. Like I mean, I have this like very pathetic thought sometimes. Like if I just like logged off and like quit everything, like, then what, right? And
Mhm.
it's not to say I don't have friendships or relationships or, whatever, nothing else going on in my life, but it's such an anchoring point. And I know that's true for a lot of people, even if they're not, willing to admit it. I mean, when I think about I was offline for ab- about 5 years. I wasn't totally offline, but I was
Mhm.
like I mostly lurked or was a not like an anonymous anime app. I wasn't quite as online as I am today, and I just didn't care about stuff because I was like physically moving a lot,
Yeah.
and I think that's again like really underappreciated. And what makes it worse is like a lot of the opportunities people have to exercise are like in these very sort of like intense, sort of mind-numbing ways. Like if you think about Barry's Boot Camp or
Mhm.
Soul Cycle, or even like more like more affordable iterations of these exercise classes, it's like blaring music, you pushing yourself until you feel sick,
Yeah.
right? Like there's very little opportunity to sort of move around in a way where you're connecting with other people, and it's like it's like truly leisurely or like exercise in a healthier way. And then the few opportunities you do have for that's organized and in a community, it's like by burners and kind of like gross and like it doesn't respect personal space.
Yeah.
So yeah, like so when I was offline, I did circus arts and I was a dancer, and like that I mean it was just my experience of life was so much different because like I all I cared about was like my husband, my neighborhood, my dance classes, my circus performances, my religion. And it's like who can like I knew about the news and I cared about it and I cared about these more like macro subcultures, but like my concerns were my immediate environment. So how do you get people to one, move around more, but two, like feel like their immediate environment is offering them something?
So then I don't know. So like what do you suggest to someone who knows that like, yeah, like I'm fixating on these macro issues because I'm disillusioned with my life. Like how does someone begin to take an interest in their own everyday life?
Um, I mean, you have to find people, which is it's easier said than done.
Mm,
Hobbies, I think, are a big help. I think there are a lot of hobbies that still are like grounded in the real world. Um, I usually like seek out niche ones because I find that's where the most passionate people are.
mhm.
Um, so like, in New York, when I lived in New York in college, and I felt like very overwhelmed by the competitive nature of the field I was in. So I like took up puppetry because my
Interesting.
logic was nobody gets into puppets if they don't really just love puppets, right? And so
Yeah.
the people I met there were just like, it was just, you know, it was they're passionate about the hobby, the act, right? It wasn't about anything other than what it was about. Um, and it's I mean it's hard, and I don't blame people who find it, who consider it an insurmountable task. It's You can't even do it in every city, let alone the suburbs or rural America. So
Yeah.
it's try your best, but there's not a lot you can do.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, for me, like I know that I need people who I can openly talk about that sense of disillusionment with, or like people who also share this question of like what makes my boring everyday life meaningful and interesting. Because like if you can share that question with someone, if you can actually talk about it, then like it starts to open your eyes to see the fact that no, like these things that can be boring and mundane actually have a value. It actually gives meaning. So I don't know. I feel like community, and I mean that's kind of what you're saying, can play a big role. So if you can take that step, then yeah, like it's possible. But sometimes it's easier said than done to take that step. You know. Mm.
And I think also like um an underrated sort of aspect of this too is like having sort of like local friction.
Mhm.
Like one thing I noticed is like, and I say this with love. My mom is sort of a gossip, right?
Okay.
And she, I swear this is a salient point, but she doesn't really. When I grew up, it was always like, so and so is doing this, and did you see her daughter and whatever. But it was like a way she connected with people, and that's been supplanted by Trump, COVID, Russia, and I think there like sort of a lack of like local gossip or like
Yeah.
local conflict plays a big role in this as well. So like, it's not enough to just like be seeing people. Like there needs to be like, you need to be really grounded in it, and you need to be like really concerned with it. Um, so like these other things don't distract you from what's going on in front of you.
Yeah, no, I definitely see how much I don't know, for me, because I grew up in a suburban environment, like like you, I went to college in New York, but before that, um, I kind of felt this not a nostalgia because I never had it, but like a longing for that kind of experience where like, there's local stuff going on, whether it's conflict or gossip or like communal gatherings, political, whatever. Um, I think the environment you're in largely shapes the way you interact with people and really the way you perceive yourself. Because like suburbia is built to atomize. It's built so that like you have your internal affairs in the home, and then you don't really know what's going on in the neighbors' houses unless you make that step to go find out. And I just see how much like as I've gotten older, like I want that kind of like you said, that local friction. Like I want those kinds of interactions because those are the things that make everyday life interesting rather than having to ship post on the internet or like fixate on these macro issues that really don't pertain that much to my actual life you know did you so you're I know you're saying with your mom, but like do you feel like the way you grew up, the environment you grew up in, like consisted of that kind of local friction, or was it mostly absent?
I'm sort of weird because like I'm very like socially anxious, and like one of the big reasons I keep my Zoom camera off is because like I can't even like I'm so bad at like making eye contact. I can't
Yeah.
even look at the screen, right? Like
Yeah.
so when I had the opportunity to dive full into like being online, I took it. And I've had like big breaks in my life, but I've always been, I've mostly always been like very anchored to a screen because
Mm,
it's hard for me to feel comfortable um, in these social environments. And I think like that big break I was talking about where I was, dancing a lot, like that was probably like the first time in my life where I was like completely unconcerned, and or not completely but mostly unconcerned, and I felt like really really physically present. But growing up, my sisters like certainly were, would describe like a very vibrant social life, but I was always very uh, I I retreated probably too much, but that's why
mm.
people think I'm like 40, right? Like had like I remember the internet from from the early 2000s onward. I was just I got online when I was a kid, like a child, like an elementary school child.
Yeah.
So that's where I grew up.
No, and it's interesting because like growing up in that suburban environment, then living in New York, after I finished undergrad and like settled into a full-time job, I ended up moving into another urban kind of area, mostly like an ethnic working class neighborhood. And I went partially because I was longing for that kind of environment, which I knew would be very different from um, the suburban experience that I grew up with. And as much as like it was super appealing and like so much more lively, so much more human on so many levels, I found that I didn't have the tools to integrate myself into it because, I mean, first the cultural barriers, but just dealing with small conflicts like in the apartment building, like having to deal with mice, having to deal with really loud neighbors, having to deal with my car getting broken into. There was just a certain social cultural sensibility that I lacked. And I was just like, damn, I really find this to be so much more appealing. And yet I am incapable of living like that, you know? So I don't know, like for me, it's been a big question of how do I embrace the fact that, yeah, like I have a certain history. I grew up in a certain kind of environment, which I didn't find ideal, but this is where I'm at. These are the cards that I've been dealt. And like, how do I make I don't know, like how do I live a life that is satisfying, knowing that no, not everything's picturesque and ideal. Um, I don't know. That's just like been a big question on my mind lately.
Yeah, it's it's hard, right? Because I mean I've seen a lot of people try to like assimilate into these communities that are attractive to them for various reasons. Maybe they like the food or the music or the
Mhm.
aesthetics, but you can't, right? Like it's it's a problem that it's really hard if you have like nothing anchoring you in that community. You can't just sort of slot yourself in, and it's not to say like you were doing something wrong. It's I've tried it myself, but it's the only way in really is if you have a partner who is of that cultural background or
Yeah.
is from that neighborhood or something. And then but then the other side of the coin is like uh people who did grow up in suburban environments try to simulate these communities even in real life, and it just never works because it's too branded or like
Yeah.
detached somehow or too strategic. So that's why I think like if you're coming from a background like ours, all you can really do is go from a place of passion, which is probably why also people, more and more people are becoming, are fans, right? Are really invested in Marvel or something.
Yeah.
But the healthier expression of that is like, you love playing the violin, and like, what does it mean to be a violinist and like really integrate that into your life? It doesn't mean playing violin all the time. There's a certain sensibility attached to it, and then finding which expression of that sensibility feels right to you, and trying to do something there. Or it's you live somewhere and it's not culturally or religiously grounded, so you can really participate in a certain way, harder than a hobby,
Yeah.
but like definitely one way to do it.
Yeah, no, and like I think for me, in a sense, like yeah, I was definitely fetishizing the neighborhood that I moved into, but it was also an attempt to retrieve something that had been lost from my own cultural legacy because like suburbia, everyone, at least all the white people, we were totally assimilated, like totally detached from our cultural roots. Very few people were like straight up wasps. Whereas for me, like so like my background's Greek and Italian, and I had some connection to those cultural roots, but I found that just being in that particular environment really worked to like gnaw at all those roots that remained. So it's like, yeah, in name I'm Greek and Italian, in name I'm Mediterranean, but like the cultural sensibility, the way that I live and conceive of my identity is like just super removed from that. And I feel like, I don't know, the experience of assimilation is contributes to this atomization. It makes you feel like, I don't know, this kind of sense of being lost or empty. So I don't know, like when I would visit neighborhoods, like I don't know, like in Newark, New Jersey, there's still like a little bit of an Italian enclave, or like in Queens in New York, like huge Greek enclave. And I would always find myself jealous of the ethnic barrio because I don't know, like things were more lively. People just had a different way of living and interacting. So I feel like I was attempting to kind of like recreate that for myself. But even if I moved into like if I moved into Astoria, like I know that I would kind of stand out like a sore thumb because sure I'm Greek, but I didn't grow up like that, you know. So I don't know. I think it's like you said, like you have to find realistic ways to kind of build that community and connect. But then no, but I wanted to refer to something from your last episode again when you're talking about like the trans phenomenon and like how these narratives are constructed, how people start to, I don't know, like think about their identity as they transition. And something I was thinking about, I mean, kind of going in a different direction, um, is I guess like I feel like I'm seeing more and more of this bent towards the transracial kind of front. Like you're seeing, I feel like I'm seeing a lot of these assimilated white people who are cut off from their ethnic roots, who are kind of identifying with other cultures. Like I think about Ariana Grande, who's started out appropriating Black culture and now she's Asian fishing, as they're saying. And it's like, sure, it's scandalous and ridiculous, but when I see that, it's like, well, if these people don't have any roots, don't identify with something larger than themselves, and like, and also with the, if we continue with this narrative of like, okay, my identity is self-constructed, it's based on not any like given circumstances, but what I feel internally. I just feel like this is the direction we're headed in. I don't know. Do you feel like that's coming? Do you feel like that's going to become more of a normal narrative at some point soon?
I think that predates people. That predates. I don't want to say like the transgender sort of like explosion, right? I don't want to
Mhm.
somehow like minimize that, but I think that's been in the water in America since day one. I mean, I'm actually like pretty passionate about this because like
Mhm.
my mother's an immigrant, and I always felt maybe not resentment, but like this detachment from my culture. My
Mhm.
dad comes from an American culture that is very vibrant and rooted, and I didn't connect with either one, and I felt I was so angry when I like encountered, she's Italian, and I encountered Italian Americans who had no problem saying they were Italian and were like divorced from the culture, right? I was like, I grew up hearing the language, and I'm not Italian. How could you be Italian? It was just like this. It
Yeah.
was blew my mind. Um, so I became like obsessed with like this idea of like hyphenated Americans and
Mhm.
these alternative histories that people construct. Like we've always been transnational, trans ethnic, transracial. I mean think about it. All the people who identify as Native American, and it's based entirely on constructed or alternative histories. All the people who say they're Irish and are, this idea that you could be 1/8, 1/16, one even one
Mhm.
fourth something. It doesn't make any sense, right? You
Yeah.
either are something or you're not. And I often say to people like, how could you be surprised that we have Rachel, a Rachel Dolezal,
Yeah.
uh, or even less obvious expressions when we grew up conditioned to say, I am Irish, when you don't like, what the hell do you know about Ireland, right? Like, what
Yeah.
connection do you have to like? It's, and you see it in how new religious movements that were born in America
Mhm.
become expressed, new age stuff, how we market our smoothies. It's a huge problem, and I don't think it's coming. I think we've been there, and it lays the groundwork for so much of our identity troubles. If only we embrace like if there's such a thing as being Floridian and proud, right? Like, or
Mhm.
Texan and proud in a way that was not mocked mercilessly. Perhaps people wouldn't need to reach in the furthest corners of their ancestry.com profile for some shred of identity.
But do you think it's going to become acceptable at some point soon? Because like they kind of crucified Rachel Dolezal.
It's already acceptable. It's just like, don't get caught, right? Like,
Mm,
it's been, look at Elizabeth Warren, right?
yeah.
It only, she like,
Okay.
she was playing Cher, right? It's been acceptable. It's just, in what ways are you do you frame it? I think
Mm.
this thing that, like, anyone would be surprised that this is happening when it's been encouraged.
Yeah. And it goes back to something that you guys were saying in that episode about this narrative of authenticity, and it breeds this sense of, I think it was you who said it, this like permanent aspiration, because like at what point are we fully ourselves? Like there's always something else we want to aspire to be, whether it's a different gender, a different race, whatever. And I think like what's scary to me is that the authenticity narrative kind of blinds us to the fact that the narrative of who I am authentically is being dictated to me by someone else in power, whether it's, again, political power, corporate power, advertisements, an algorithm. Um, I don't know. It's like it's so deceptive in the sense that like, no, like I'm being my real self, but like, but where am I getting these ideas from? And at what point am I done? At what point am I fulfilled? You know?
Right. Like what even underpins what you like? Like, is it, I feel like that's it's a very basic, like, low-hanging fruit question, but it's like, are you maximizing pleasure? Like, what is
Yeah.
happiness? Which I don't want to sound like, some like weed smoking little sister, right? But like,
Yeah.
it's a difficult thing to define that I don't think anyone really has. And that's why they're so lost, because they don't know what the goal is and what the end point is.
Yeah. Mm. So last thing that I want to ask you before we wrap up, kind of tying together, I guess, the atomization kind of piece and also the question about like authentic gender identity. So something that I see, I guess, I mean, has always been part of advertisement kind of culture, but I see more and more on people's personal social media pages, specifically having to do with men, is like the whole phenomenon of thirst traps, especially on Instagram. Like the fact that it's becoming normal for men to want to get attention for physical appearance, sexual appeal. Um, I don't know. Like, I'm really curious to understand what you think is behind it, because for me, it's like traditionally this is a feminine trait, like to want to be gazed upon for your sex appeal, for aesthetics. Um, I don't know. Like, what do you see behind it? What do you think the implications are? Because, like, I don't know. I've been trying to wrap my head around it for a while.
I think the internet does a good job of disconnecting us from our physical bodies. And again, that sounds like an obvious point, but I think it runs like so much deeper than we really realize, or if we can intellectualize it, like, I don't think we really own it yet. And this manifests in all sorts of ways. Um, but on top of that, for men, they're in a moment where it really is easy to be an invisible man, and nobody wants to be invisible or overlooked. Um, and there's all sorts of different expressions and sort of fighting back against that frustration. You could be a provocateur online and be part of, like, frog Twitter, or you could be a bodybuilder, or you're an incel. And all of these things are sort of, it's not exclusively attacking this issue, but it's definitely a big part of it. And one expression is probably like, you know, this if this is the currency of the environment that I'm in 99% of the time, I may as well. Um, you know, I can't imagine what it's like to be a man, and it's like your choices are ignored completely unless you have some other sort of exceptional aspect, like you're willing to, post racial slurs in like a sufficiently humorous way, right? Something like this, or like, maybe I'll try what women are doing and post my body. It's worth a shot, right? And then if you do it once and it gets positive feedback, what, like, why wouldn't you do it again? It's a much, I'm sure it feels much better than just nobody looking at you at all.
Mm. Yeah, no, and it's these larger questions about individual agency, not just for men, but also for women, under the kind of cultural conditions we're in. Like, what gives our everyday lives meaning, but what also makes us useful, what makes us feel like we're living with a purpose, But I think it goes back to, again, like beginning on the micro level, beginning on the communal level, and finding people you can actually have these conversations with and ask these questions. Because outside of that, then I just feel like it's so easy to get trapped in the web where like everything's just liquid floating around.
Yeah, and if you're with other people and you're like physically in and in an environment that's not just you, I feel like if you're online, you really only have yourself and you're constantly looking at yourself,
Mhm.
even if you aren't literally looking at yourself. So anything that you know takes you out of your own head is probably very helpful.
Yeah. So before we go, anything that you want to plug?
You could follow me on Twitter at default_friend, or on my Substack, defaultfriend.substack.com. It is very weird, but hopefully you enjoy it.
No, well worth reading for sure. All right. Well, thanks for coming on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.